I'm Judy Stiles. Thank you for joining us this week on Newsmakers. Well, the election season is winding down as people have been talking for months and years, I guess, perhaps about the election this year. Today, we're doing a follow-up interview with members from the Political Science Department here on campus, Will Delahanty, Nicole Shoaf, and Nicoletti. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We talked last spring before the semester ended, kind of looking ahead to what might happen this year. Are we meeting expectations of what you were thinking at that time?
Well, I mean, I think nationally, I think a lot of people had kind of not expected the rise in prominence of Donald Trump, and so because election fundamentals would have suggested that he wouldn't really have had a chance versus
when
say
we were talking
like
in the spring, he was just one of those people.
Exactly, and so the dynamics of the election are very, very interesting. I think maybe some political scientists probably wouldn't have assumed that Trump would have that prominence and resonance for voters.
So this election year is really giving you as political scientists a lot to look at, how things are happening and why things are happening.
Absolutely. The books written 20 years from now are going to be fascinating, trying to parse out how Trump came to be so popular in this particular era.
And what about, we hear so much about the divisiveness of this election. Is that something else that you're looking at a lot?
Absolutely. I mean, America has been consistently polarizing since the 1960s as the parties sort of realigned towards the liberal and conservative sort of stances. And what we're kind of seeing now is the manifestation of this polarization working its way out in this election. And one of the really interesting things we're seeing is a combination of media attention, which is really what's kind of springboards Donald Trump into the limelight and gets people interested. And also, voters who traditionally haven't turned out in the past are being mobilized now by the Trump campaign. And this is primarily how he won the primary and seriously changing the landscape possibly for the presidential election.
So some new approaches in campaigning this year.
Sure. The rhetoric too that's used by Donald Trump is kind of historically different as well. So I'm not sure if it's also context dependent in the sense that there are issues that Donald Trump is emphasizing and speaking about them in a certain way that mobilizes those voters that Dr. Nicoletti referred to that maybe wouldn't, right, absent that kind of discussion.
Now you mentioned the role of the media, and of course this is a very media-rich campaign, whether you're talking about social media or the evening news or cable or whatever. Do you feel that people are getting the information they want through all these media sources, or how is that playing a role in their informing the voters?
Well, I mean, it's definitely keeping the election on people's minds, and then you have, again, not to emphasize Trump, but I mean, he's unique in the sense of his celebrity status. He already had that pre-existing relationship to media generally. So I think it's the confluence of those things. But I think voters, are getting exposure to a greater array of information sources. The question is whether or not they're getting exposure to a broader array of different perspectives within those sources. It's not clear that that's necessarily true, but at least I think they're having more information.
Now, of course, we're coming off of debates as we're recording this, and that's one of the aspects of the fall as you get closer to the election. Some people watching may say, well, what effect does a debate really have on the voters at this point? When you're just, days, you're counting days now, for elections.
It really depends. Debates don't typically dissuade hardcore supporters. If you are a hardcore Trump supporter, an interesting debate performance isn't probably going to make you switch your allegiance. The people who are sort of less informed, who tend to be more moderate, the leftover undecided voters, the debates are a good chance for them, particularly if they're just now starting to tune into the election. If they didn't pay a lot of attention in the primaries or in the early general election, by the time the debates start, they're starting to clue in, and so they can get a real good sense of the candidates' issue positions and their temperament.
Now, when we think of debates, sometimes people may think of a more formal presentation. What we've seen, sometimes they're not necessarily controlled situations, it seems.
The debates have been pretty wild, I think, in this election term. I mean, Dr. Shoaf is correct that generally debates, the candidates just really don't want to make any gaffes, right? Because the idea is pretty much the partisans have chosen who they're going to vote for, and you've got a very small segment in the middle who they're trying to pander to, and so just not making a mistake is important. But in these debates, I mean, Donald Trump isn't, his campaign has said he's not a well-polished politician, right? And so when he goes into his debates, he's kind of a wild card. But I will say we've heard things in these debates that pretty much are unprecedented in American politics. I mean, to say that if you're elected, you're going to jail your opponent, that's something we would hear from some Latin American dictatorships, possibly, right? And then just the sort of off-the-cuff language, they've been pretty out of character for American politics.
Well, and this election is also very interesting. Because you have another potential historical outcome. Clinton would be the first female president in U.S. history. So it's this kind of interesting dynamic of having a celebrity in conjunction with someone who's had a long history in politics, but nevertheless represents a very important potential shift, right, in the presidency.
So a lot of things that people talk about historic elections, this is when people are watching and see what these trends and what you're looking at. And some people, would think about, well, we still have a third party. Are you hearing any possibilities of that playing a role at all as voters who are maybe not happy with the other two choices?
I think the third-party candidates' poll numbers have peaked and they're starting to come back down. I think sort of they seem attractive at the beginning as the general election is getting heated up. I think the closer it becomes to the election, the lower the poll numbers are going to go, because I think voters realize, although they may want a viable third-party candidate, at this point we don't have one. Gary Johnson, I think, maxed out polling around 15% recently.
So there's no hope that he's going to really gain a lot off the situation.
The chances of him even pulling in a single electoral vote are pretty minuscule at this point.
Now, you mentioned polls. That's something that a lot of people hear about, and it seems like the debate wasn't even over, and people are out there saying, we're getting reaction right now. How does this play a role into the whole political campaign situation, polling the voters?
Well, I mean, the candidates want to know, in the case of the debate, if they won, because ultimately they can use that, as a way to kind of talk about their ability to lead voters in that sense. But the polling itself currently would suggest very close race nationally. Now, of course, that might vary by state. So the polling is used by candidates to lead the public, but at the same time, nationally, it's not clear that the polls are decisively showing which candidate would ultimately win the election.
You mentioned the states, and one of the things we hear so much about, Nick, is the key states. That you have some key states when it comes to electoral college, and that some states you don't even visit when you're a candidate.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you're a Democrat or a Republican, you don't really want to campaign too much in New York because you're really sure it's going to go Democrat, right? If you're a Republican or a Democrat you don't want to campaign too much in Texas because you know it's going to go Republican. But you really want to campaign in places like Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio, sometimes Michigan, because these are the places that have a lot of electoral votes, and they actually are possibly a toss-up. And so if you're really interested in polls, first thing, you should look at the ones in the battleground states because they are really important. And second, you should never believe those straw polls that are conducted over the internet or by viewers or something like that, because they don't have representative samples and they're not scientific. And so you really want to look at some of the more scientific polls. You can go to places like Real Clear Politics and they will aggregate them for you, good websites to go to.
Right. So you need a good source of information if you're going to say the numbers show this. Well, who did that survey? Who did that poll? What the results show? So forth. I'm curious, on campus, three of you work with political science students. We have an organization of students. What's the feeling on the campus for college students in this election year?
Well, first of all, just general interest, and I think it might be because of the unique nature of Trump to some degree, but it's really interesting. So a lot of students are the ones that I get the opportunity to teach, they tend to be somewhat supportive of Trump. They also, a sizable majority maybe are supportive of Clinton, but for some reason they're more mobilized and more active intellectually than they have been in past electoral cycles.
So you're seeing some difference in the students and their reactions.
Yeah, exactly.
So are students getting more active, involved, wanting to see more of them actively maybe campaigning or talking to their peers?
Absolutely. We have a number of our students who are volunteering for various campaigns around the state. Both governors' campaigns have a number of our students volunteering for them in internship capacity and on their free time. The student organization, the Political Science Association on campus, is holding debate viewing parties that are getting excellent turnout. Voter registration is way up among students. It's sort of something we sort of track. It's really interesting to see the students are going out of their way to become more involved.
And for some of our students, especially those maybe freshmen, this is their first chance to vote in a presidential election.
Absolutely, and this is sort of, they're really interested. The media environment is rich, and the Center for Legal Studies has been running some voter registration drives around campus, and we're registering people all the way up to the deadline on Wednesday. We've got an enormous turnout from MSSU students, especially people who have moved or need absentee ballots. So it feels different than some of the previous elections we've had, at least anecdotally on campus, for sure.
So a lot more of an interest along those lines. Historically, you mentioned the people who have already made up their minds. We have these numbers that show it's close. We've had a lot of close elections in recent history. Have you seen anything in trends as political scientists as far as the impact of maybe those last-minute ads or what people do in those last couple of weeks before the elections?
Just initially, I'd probably agree with Dr. Shoaf in saying that, I mean, the last-minute activities, maybe of debates, mobilization might affect those people who are still somewhat undecided. I mean, the one thing that's kind of interesting about the current election is that on the basis of certain kind of underlying fundamentals, we would have assumed that that Clinton maybe would have taken the race handedly, and that still might occur. But it seems like if the election is very close, then possibly those last-minute activities, campaigning, media advertisements, might have an effect at the margins, but maybe wouldn't necessarily shift the electorate, I don't think, decisively in one direction versus another.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult because we talk about poll numbers at the national level, and really that means very little. What we really have to focus on are the states that are competitive, like Nick was mentioning a little bit ago. And so the debates might be more useful in Philadelphia.
Those states that are really playing a key role.
Yeah, there's not going to be much that either candidate can do to get Utah to change the way it's going to vote. The good money's on.
That's why they're spending their money in the advertising in those big states. We're not going to see a lot of those campaign ads in Missouri, but if you travel to those states, you'd see them and so forth. How about the money people are spending on advertising?
Yeah, it's gone way up. And then with the 2010 Citizens United decision, we actually see a lot of super PACs spending a lot of money in the media environment, which those are completely separate from the campaign ads run by the candidates. And so we're probably going to see some of the largest numbers spent on the media environment in this election. And that was saying a lot because the 2012 election was a lot of expenditures.
Now, something we've heard throughout the campaigns and even after the debates is fact-checking. That citizens need to make sure what they're saying is true. And there are a lot of more options now how to check those facts. Sure.
I mean, you have organizations that appeal to it. Voters themselves can do it relatively easily, kind of online. The thing that's interesting is that historically, fact-checking, you would imagine, would always be relevant. I mean, especially since elected officials or candidates would want to maybe alter, right, the truth or shade it, if you will, from their perspective. I'm not sure if the current environment, which is kind of talking about with polarization with Dr. Nicoletti, if that's heightening the notion that there is a distinction between facts versus not. So it's interesting that it seems to be more salient now, but still would be important, I think, in any electoral context.
So do you have students that'll come in after a debate and say, well, I looked up online and that was a false statement?
A little bit, but I've gotten them into the habit of we all go to a couple of fact-checking websites. If we're going to talk about the debate, you have to watch the debate and you have to check at least one fact-checking website because there's no sense in talking about the debate if you don't have an assessment on how honest the candidates are being, particularly in this election where the candidates are often saying things that are outright inaccurate. When you can pull up a Twitter feed for one of the candidates and go, yeah, no, you did say that that easily, it's really important to check out the fact-checking.
Of course, we're talking about students. What about the general populace? Do you think many people, John Q. Public, will take the time to say, I'm going to go online to see what they said was true?
I do, but the source matters. And so even in fact-checking can be just as spinned as any other type of political activity. And so what we see is there's some really good ones like PolitiFact will do some fact-checking. But then, Hillary Clinton has her own website to do it, and Donald Trump has some sources to do it. And a lot of these facts are actually very gray areas, right? And some of the things that could be a lie for one person, might not be a lie to another depending on how it's represented. And so one of the things we have to remember is that in a world where you can choose the media that you want, right, you get this selective exposure, and still voters are able to that cognitive dissonance, resist the cost from given new information by looking at the websites or TV channels that they prefer. And so I'm not sure that fact-checking actually has that much of an impact in the overall environment.
There's so many more sources of information today with the explosion of media and what you have and so forth.
Absolutely.
Well, let's take it down from the presidential to, for instance, the U.S. Senate races and then, even the state of Missouri. Do you feel that what's happening nationally, is it being reflected on those like Senate races and other races that we're going to be dealing with?
Well, I think it's probably true that some kind of weak or vulnerable Republican incumbents in the Senate are maybe kind of looking anxiously at the decision making of Trump and kind of whether or not nationally if Trump's numbers are going to kind of translate into state specific contexts. So I think it's not clear yet whether or not Trump is going to make it hard for down ballot candidates to be successful, particularly incumbents. But it's looking increasingly, because of the hemorrhaging of kind of support from some of those Republican incumbent senators, that maybe that might be true.
Do you feel that there are many people that still vote or would vote a straight ticket, or are people going to look at the candidates?
I think there's a lot of straight ticket voting. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, particularly the further you go down the ballot, the less well-known the people are. If 63% of Americans can't identify their member of the U.S. House, the chances of them being able to correctly identify their state legislator, their state senator, and on down the ballot to dog catcher it's asking a lot. In the United States, we ask people to vote frequently and on many, many issues. And so I think while people can distinguish between the presidential candidates and the gubernatorial candidates, I think when you get much further down, you're asking a lot for people to pick and choose between two different parties on candidates.
And many of those lower level candidates, you're not seeing them advertising either. And you may see their name for the first time on the ballot.
Yeah, I mean, they're low information, as Nicole is saying. And so partisanship definitely matters, right? The best way to make a good political decision under a low information environment is to vote your party. The problem with that is for those people who are still, and there's a very small amount. People think independents are huge, but it's really only about 10% of the overall electorate. Only about 5% of those people actually vote. For those people, flipping between the parties is actually something that they could possibly do. And so we have this thing called the coat tail effect in presidential elections, where the winner of the presidential election will give a bump to the down ballot candidates. And so if it's true that Donald Trump or Hillary or vice versa, but right now it looks like Clinton is a little bit up, if it's true that they win the presidency, it is possible for the Democrats to take back the Senate, and possibly they only need 30 seats to take back the House. That could be a huge shift. And so this morning you saw Paul Ryan said he's no longer going to defend Donald Trump, and that the party has basically carte blanche to separate themselves from their own presidential candidate. That's in order to stop the bleeding, right? Or to try and prevent those majorities from getting lost. And so this could make a difference depending on how well Trump does electorally.
Statewide, we mentioned Missouri governor's race. There are a lot of ads already, and commercials. People are maybe scratching their head. There's accusations back and forth. Seems like there's being a lot of money, a lot of effort put into the race this year.
It is. I mean, the thing that's kind of interesting too is that the Democratic candidate, Koster, is not the traditional Democrat that we might assume, and then Greitens, is not necessarily the traditional Republican. So I mean, it's different maybe than what we would expect. Although, having said that, I mean, the fact that Nixon is no longer able to run, I mean, when you have an open seat, Koster is not surprising. Greitens maybe wants to take advantage of that, kind of open opportunity.
We hear a lot, perhaps, in these campaigns of the people attacking, you have the outsiders and the long-timers, and people attacking those who have been in government. This is something we've even heard at the gubernatorial level.
Absolutely. We've heard this for decades. It's a common practice in elections, because it's much easier to stand outside and go, the people who are in office have messed things up. I'm the person who can change things for the better. That's been used in presidential elections going back decades. And so it's not hard to see why that would be happening now. Koster has a long history in both county and state politics, whereas Greitens a newcomer to elected office. And so he has an advantage there, where he can stand outside. He hasn't been involved in the political fray. And so he can say, well, I'm the fresh breath that you need to fix.
That those guys did everything wrong, we're going to fix it type of approach, tying that together. So those type of races across the different levels, the insiders, the outsiders, people looking along those lines. We have other statewide races, and some of the names people might recognize. I think there's an Ashcroft and a Carnahan, so you're getting like second generation political families in some of these.
Well, the thing that's really interesting about like a Russ Carnahan would be the issue of name recognition. I mean, it goes to Dr. Nicoletti's comment earlier about information heuristic shortcuts. I mean, if you have a name that has a long history in the state, like a Carnahan would, it makes it easier potentially for you, even if you're not kind of a well-established candidate. So it's not surprising that you might see those people who have connections to that political family ultimately trying to seek office, not solely based upon the name, but that makes it easier in that sense.
Makes their case. I've seen that name before, and I remember that
exactly.
person and tying that together. Well, Missouri has a full ballot with a lot of statewide races and things people have to look at. Trying to find out that information as well, I imagine that becomes a challenge. How do you find out about these people who are running for the statewide offices?
Oh, I mean, they all have websites, and so it's much easier now than it was 25 years ago. All the candidates have websites, PACs have websites, so there's lots of information out there. I think the larger problem is not, can I find information or can I find enough information? It's, can I find information from an unbiased source, or can I readily identify the bias in the sources? Because the campaigns are going to highlight all the good things about their candidate, and they're going to shine their candidate in the best light possible. The PACs and the super PACs are going to do the exact same thing. So finding sources of unbiased information, that is far more challenging for these local and these state races because they don't get the national attention. And the way the media environment has changed over the last 25 years, you see far fewer local reporters covering state politics. There's so much emphasis on sort of AP and sort of picking up national articles that it's really difficult to get quality information.
So the source of the advertising is something to look at. You know, we look at these ads where they're attacking each other, and at the bottom it'll say "paid for by so and so."
Yeah, because everyone has an interest, right? And the ads are clearly going to be biased in favor of that interest, and so you've got to kind of sort the truth from the fiction, or you know, sort of the bias, if you will. And so you can go to the State Department's website. The Secretary of State has the elections on there, a little bit of information. You can also visit pages like Ballotpedia when you're going to talk about some of these amendments on the ballot. We'll talk about some of those. And then you can try and get your information from local media sources like the Star. But you always have to remember that even newspapers have some bias. But your best places, I would say, is mainstream media outlets.
Well, you mentioned the statewide ballot measures, and I know Missouri voters go to the polls. It's more than just people. There are questions on the ballot, and it's not just a couple this year.
Yeah, there's, I think, 6 different propositions that in constitutional amendments Missouri voters are going to get to vote on, including 2 separate propositions that would raise taxes on cigarettes in Missouri. Missouri cigarette taxes are 17 cents a pack, which is the lowest in the nation. The nationwide average is, I think, $1.65. Some states have upwards of $5 per pack taxes. So we are way behind on that. And so the voters have 2 options, and they could vote for both.
So they could both pass and then say, we want the money to go here, we want the money to go there.
Yeah, one of them would put the money towards infrastructure, roads and bridges and things like that, and the other would put it towards early childhood education. And so it just sort of depends on where you want the money to go.
Now, these measures were brought to the ballot through a petition process. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the way Missouri does it's interesting because you have to collect signatures from all around the state, and all the different districts, and they have to be registered voters. And there's a long process of ensuring that the people who sign them are indeed valid voters. There were dozens of initiatives that got started in Missouri, but only 6 ended up making it onto the ballot.
They actually verified that, yes, these are legitimate voters signing the petitions and
Absolutely.
so forth. Well, something else that we've heard a lot about is deals with the voter ID, which the state legislature dealt with at their veto session, but now the voters have a say about that. So.
Well, I mean, it strikes me, it's kind of interesting that other states, the argument usually is voter ID is necessary to avoid fraud and to avoid kind of this problem of people who shouldn't vote, in fact, voting. But what's also interesting is that the rate of fraud in that sense is very low in the United States. So it's not clear, at least initially, how the language of fraud justifies kind of the potential strict rules for submitting photo identification. Although, I mean, it's also interesting that it occurs in election years, and the issue is whether or not there are, partisan reasons why you would pursue kind of those voter ID laws.
So a lot of things playing together on that
yeah.
and so forth. So this is kind of tying in, following up, not necessarily following up, but the legislature's dealt with, and now the people vote on it. So what would happen afterwards after the people approve it? So tying that together. Other items that we've, parks and conservation, there's a sales tax, but that's nothing new.
Yeah, that's a ballot measure that comes up about every 10 years. It's a tax that was started in, I think, 1984. And so about every decade it comes back, and the voters have to approve it again. And the money goes towards protecting water and soil in the state of Missouri and pays for our state parks.
Okay, so that's part of the budgeting for the state of Missouri, using that sales tax for running those
Absolutely.
operations. And then something that we talk about advertising, but campaign contributions. That's something people have been talking about, especially in the state of Missouri. There's a measure on the ballot dealing with that?
Yeah, Missouri used to have limits on how much money you could donate to a political party or a political campaign in each election cycle. A few years back, they removed those. And so unlike at the national level, in the state of Missouri, you can donate as much money as you want to candidates and parties. If I had the money, I could donate $20 million to a candidate in an election cycle, and that would be completely acceptable.
Are we seeing a lot of that money coming into the campaigns this year? You're seeing a lot of individuals or corporations, somebody giving large contributions?
I think so. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that would suggest that outside money, which is actually kind of a source of debate. I mean, if money comes within the state, but is still nevertheless large,
Right.
that money from within the state would simply maybe convey state-based interest. But if the money is coming from the outside in, it somehow suggests that interests, not necessarily related to Missouri, would have a role to play in Missouri elections.
Trying to influence Missouri politics.
Yeah, exactly, of course.
So this is asking the voters to say we want to put a limit on that.
To reinstate the limit that we used to have.
Okay, so we're going back to the way they had the laws originally. So, and then there's also a sales tax or a tax-related issue for people. And then talking about a new, prohibition of some sort of taxes?
Yeah, we've seen some states in the U.S. adopt new taxes on services, so haircuts, yoga classes, things like that. And the proposition on the Missouri ballot would prohibit the state and local governments from instituting new use taxes on services.
So these taxes don't exist now, it's just we don't want them in the future.
Correct.
And so a lot of this citizen involvement, getting the petitions and getting things on the ballot, that's been a tradition in Missouri. I mean, we've seen that throughout the years, issues.
Yeah, Missouri actually has a really strong tradition of direct democracy. I mean, the thing that talked about by Dr. Shoaf too is the degree to which the constitutional amendments and the petitions, initiative petitions, need to have this widespread popular support.
Although they don't have to. We've seen in the modern era, they're not always as grassroots as we'd like to think
They're really
are.
organized.
Yeah, and there are a lot of outside groups from outside of the state who sponsor these types of events because it takes a lot of money to hire people to go around to collect these signatures. Many of the people who gather the signatures are paid per signature. They're not necessarily diehard supporters of the issue. Sometimes they are, but oftentimes this is outside money from interests outside of the state trying to change Missouri politics under the guise of our grassroots initiatives.
Grassroots are like sliding in there.
Yeah.
Well, as you look forward, we hear about voter turnout. Any feelings about this year? Are we going to see more people than last time?
I think we are. I think we're going to see, if not 2012 numbers, slightly larger than 2012 numbers. The media environment is rich for that. And that's going to help local elections and statewide elections get higher voter turnout as well. Now, there is something to be said, though, about people who don't like either candidate, right? You hear a lot about, I don't like either candidate, so I'm going to abstain. It is possible that we have a lot of abstentions. And that could help or hurt either candidate depending on who stays home. And then, of course, we have the third party, and so you could protest vote the third party. If you're a Republican in Missouri and you vote for somebody like Gary Johnson, what you're really doing is taking away from Trump's allotment of votes. And if you're a Democrat and you vote for Gary Johnson, you're taking away Clinton's vote, or Jill Stein, or whatever third party. The thing is, usually third party candidates, you vote for whichever one's closer to your ideology. And so if Gary Johnson does do well and people do come out and protest vote, that's probably going to hurt Trump more than Clinton.
So a lot of things to look forward to as we wind down here in the final days. I'd like to thank the three of you for visiting today, sharing some information with our audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For the
You're
invite.
welcome. And thank you for joining us this week on Newsmakers. I'm Judy Stiles. Hope you can join me again next week at the same time on the station. We'll see you then.